Imagine standing on a frozen February morning in 1587. The wind cuts like knives across Tower Green. 300 people huddle together, their breath rising in ghostly clouds. At the center stands a woman, a queen. Mary, Queen of Scots, kneels before the block, her fate sealed by politics sharper than any blade. The executioner raises his axe. 1 strike. 2 strikes. A third, final blow. Her head falls, and with it, a bloodline that would echo through centuries. Fast forward 400 years. In a Paris tunnel, flashes of cameras replace the gleam of steel. Another woman, another icon, another victim of a bloodline marked by tragedy, Princess Diana. Beloved as the people's princess, she was admired for her compassion. Yet few realized that her veins carried not just grace and empathy, but the legacy of some of England's darkest rulers. Kings who burned heretics, queens who ordered executions, nobles who grew rich on the ruins of the innocent. What if I told you Diana's story was never just modern celebrity? That her untimely death was the latest chapter in a family saga drenched in power, betrayal, and blood? From humble sheep farmers who rose to fortune, to Tudor courts dripping with intrigue, to centuries of scandal, survival, and compromise, the Spencers were always there, at the center of history's most brutal turns. This isn't just the story of Diana. It's the story of a dynasty that thrived on blood and power, and of a woman who tried to redeem it with love and humanity. It is tempting to believe that great families of history begin with crowns and castles, with the privilege of noble birth written into their very first breath. But the Spencers did not. Their story began in the muddy fields of Warwickshire, where sheep grazed on windswept hills and wool, simple, coarse wool, was worth its weight in gold. In the late 15th century, England was still crawling out of medieval shadows. The Wars of the Roses tore the country apart, cousins turned on cousins, fathers on sons, and kings were made and unmade on bloody battlefields. Amid this chaos, a man named Henry Spencer died in 1478. His life had been modest by the standards of nobility, but his descendants would inherit something far greater than land, a talent for survival. They learned early that in England, power belonged to those who could seize opportunity when the world seemed most unstable. By the 1480s, the wool trade was booming. England's white gold poured across the Channel, and families who once worked the soil now dealt in fortunes. The Spencers were among them, shepherds turned merchants, merchants turned landowners. They were not aristocrats, not yet, but they had money, and in an age when crowns were bought with swords and debts, money was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Still, wealth alone could not secure permanence. In a kingdom where monarchs fell as quickly as they rose, only blood tied to the throne could ensure survival. The Spencers understood this. It was not enough to thrive on the margins, they had to step inside the deadly dance of kings and queens. Their chance arrived in the reign of Henry VIII, a man whose name alone is enough to conjure images of power and cruelty. Henry's court was not a palace of elegance, it was a spider's web. One wrong move could end in ruin, disgrace, or a gruesome execution. Nobles who dined at the king's table one night might lose their heads the next morning. And yet, this dangerous theater was precisely where the Spencers chose to build their future. John Spencer, born in 1524, proved himself a man of ruthless pragmatism. While others gambled on loyalty to fading causes, John observed, calculated, and moved with precision. He watched Henry VIII tear apart the old order, executing wives, dissolving monasteries, burning heretics alive, and he made a decision. If England was to be remade in the king's image, then the Spencers would not resist. They would adapt. They would profit. In 1519, Henry VIII knighted John Spencer. With a single stroke of a sword, the Spencers became bound to the Tudor crown. From that day forward, their fate was no longer tied to sheep in Warwickshire but to the throne of England itself. The rewards were immediate. In 1508, John purchased Althorpe, an estate that would remain in the family for centuries, standing as both a sanctuary and a silent witness to their rise. But the true treasure was not the land. It was access. Access to the court where decisions were made, where alliances were forged, and where secrets determined who lived and who died. To outsiders, the Spencer Chapel at Great Brington looked like a place of worship, a quiet sanctuary for family prayers. In truth, it was also a mausoleum for ambition, a resting place for those who had gambled in Tudor politics and won, at least long enough to pass their legacy forward. The Tudors were a dynasty built on blood, and the Spencers became their shadow. Every scandal, every execution, every act of brutality rippled through the family's history. They were not innocent bystanders. They were beneficiaries. When monasteries were stripped of wealth, Spencer coffers grew fat. When rivals were executed, Spencer hands reached out to seize the spoils. And when Henry VIII demanded loyalty, they gave it, even as wives were led to the scaffold and friends betrayed under torture. It is here that the darkness in the Spencer bloodline began to take form, not simply in deeds committed, but in choices accepted. They learned that survival demanded flexibility, that power required compromise, and that morality was often the first casualty of ambition. Imagine John Spencer walking the corridors of Whitehall Palace. The walls whisper with secrets, the air heavy with incense and fear. Courtiers bow and scrape, each one rehearsing their loyalty like lines in a play. The king, massive and volatile, sits at the center of it all, his moods dictating the fate of thousands. To defy him is death. To serve him is profit. To hesitate is disaster. John does not hesitate. He chooses the path that ensures his family's future, even if it means tying their fortunes to a monarch whose very name would become synonymous with cruelty. This was the true beginning of the Spencer dynasty. Not with honor on the battlefield or virtue in the chapel, but with the quiet calculation of a family that understood one brutal truth: in Tudor England, survival was not given, it was taken. From Warwickshire pastures to the glittering yet perilous halls of Henry's court, the Spencers had crossed the threshold. And though they had gained land, title, and wealth, they had also inherited something far darker: the burden of complicity. Every drop of blood spilled by the Tudors, every heretic burned, every queen silenced, became part of the legacy they carried. Centuries later, when Diana Spencer stepped into the global stage, she carried not just the elegance of nobility, but the weight of this inheritance. For the Spencers had risen high, but they had risen on foundations built of blood and fear. The first act of their story was complete. The sheep farmers had become courtiers. The merchants had become nobles. The survivors had become participants. And the family motto, "God defend the right," would take on meanings more sinister than its pious words suggested. But this was only the beginning. The Spencers had secured their place beside the Tudors, yet in doing so, they had tied themselves to a dynasty where betrayal was routine, and death was never far. What followed would be a cascade of executions, scandals, and alliances that would embed the Spencer bloodline into the very heart of England's darkest history. The road from Warwickshire to Westminster was paved not just with wool and wealth, but with blood, and the Spencers were ready to walk it, no matter the cost. Once the Spencers had secured their foothold in Tudor society, they found themselves caught in a world where loyalty shifted with the wind and justice was little more than a mask for power. To survive meant more than bowing before the throne, it meant learning how to benefit from the king's cruelty without ever appearing complicit. Few families managed this balancing act. The Spencers did. And they thrived. Henry VIII, larger than life in both body and appetite, reshaped England in ways no monarch had dared before. He was not content to rule, he wanted to dominate, to bend religion, politics, even the very structure of society, to his will. His court became a theater of both splendor and terror, where nobles smiled at feasts one evening and awaited the axe the next morning. And the Spencers? They watched carefully, calculating which direction to move, always ready to seize advantage from the chaos. The dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s was one of the bloodiest social upheavals in English history. Centuries-old abbeys were stripped of wealth, their monks cast out, their sacred relics desecrated. For many, it was sacrilege. For the Spencers, it was opportunity. Land and riches that had once belonged to the church flowed into the hands of those who stayed close to the crown. And the Spencers, bound to Henry by knighthood and loyalty, were among those who prospered. But material gain came with a darker inheritance, proximity to executions that would define the Tudor age. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn, the king's second wife, walked the steps to her scaffold. History often remembers her as arrogant, ambitious, manipulative. But on that morning she was simply a woman betrayed by the man she had once captivated. Officially, her crimes were adultery, incest with her brother, and treason against the crown. In truth, she was guilty only of failing to give Henry the son he demanded. The charges were fabricated, the witnesses coerced, the outcome predetermined. The Spencers, tied to court life through their connection to Anne's sister Mary, had a front-row seat to this judicial murder. They did not intervene. How could they? To question the king's justice was to invite death. And so they watched as Anne mounted the scaffold at the Tower of London, clad in a simple grey gown, her dark hair tucked beneath a hood. She addressed the crowd with a composure that astonished even her enemies. "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." The irony was bitter, her words carefully chosen to protect her daughter Elizabeth's future. Moments later, a French executioner, specially imported for his skill, delivered a single, swift blow of his sword. Anne's head fell, her lips still moving in silent prayer. Witnesses swore her eyes flickered for several seconds before death claimed her completely. The Spencers carried that memory, not as trauma, but as a reminder of how fragile fortune could be. Today you were in the king's bed, tomorrow in an unmarked grave beneath the Tower Chapel. The lesson was simple: adapt or die. 6 years later, another young woman would prove the point again. Catherine Howard, barely 20, became Henry's fifth wife. She was vivacious, naive, and utterly unprepared for the dangers of a court that devoured the innocent as readily as it did the ambitious. Accused of unchastity before her marriage and of infidelity after, she was condemned without trial. Henry even changed the law to ensure her execution, declaring it treason for a mad woman to marry the king. On the night before her death in 1542, Catherine reportedly practiced laying her head on the block in her cell, rehearsing the moment of surrender. At dawn, she walked to the scaffold, pale and trembling, yet determined to meet death with dignity. Her final words were not of treason or ambition, but of love. "I die a queen," she said, "but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." The Spencers, connected by blood through the Boleyn line, were once again bound to tragedy. Another young woman silenced, another lesson carved in blood: power was conditional, affection temporary, and survival depended not on virtue, but on knowing when to disappear into the background. But the Tudor court's brutality was not limited to queens. Under Mary I, Bloody Mary, the fires of religious persecution consumed hundreds. Protestants tied to stakes screamed as flames devoured their bodies, their prayers drowned by the roar of crowds and crackling wood. Some took 40 agonizing minutes to die. The Spencers, Catholic by tradition but pragmatic in practice, watched as lands were seized from Protestant victims and redistributed. Once again, they emerged wealthier, not holier. Then came the execution that would echo loudest through their bloodline, the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587. She had been imprisoned for 19 long years, a queen reduced to a pawn in Elizabeth I's political game. On the morning of her execution, she dressed carefully, black gown, white veil, and beneath them a red petticoat, the color of martyrdom. Every detail was a message. Even her death would be theater. The execution itself was a horror. The first blow struck the back of her head. The second cut deep but did not sever. Only the third completed the grisly work. When the executioner lifted her head for the crowd, her auburn wig came away, revealing grey hair. Her loyal dog crept from beneath her skirts, whimpering, soaked in blood, refusing to leave her body. For the Spencers, this was more than another spectacle of Tudor cruelty. Through carefully arranged marriages, they were tied to Mary's bloodline. Her death was not just a political act, it was part of their family inheritance. The echoes of that February morning at Fotheringhay Castle would reverberate centuries later, when Diana Spencer met her own end beneath the flashing lights of a Paris tunnel. The Spencers did not engineer these deaths. But they learned from them. They absorbed the lessons of Tudor brutality, that power is fleeting, that loyalty is conditional, and that survival often demands silence in the face of horror. They became masters of adaptation, prospering while others perished, watching queens die while keeping their own heads firmly attached. Yet with every execution witnessed, every confiscated estate pocketed, the family wove themselves deeper into a legacy soaked in blood. By the end of the Tudor era, they were no longer just participants in history. They were beneficiaries of its darkest chapters. And though centuries would pass, though fashions and monarchs would change, the pattern remained. The Spencers had built their fortune not on sheep or trade, but on survival amid cruelty. And this inheritance, this instinct for compromise and adaptation, would flow down their bloodline, waiting for the moment when another daughter of the Spencers would try, against all odds, to redeem it. By the early 17th century, the Tudor dynasty was gone, replaced by the Stuarts. Yet the shadows of Tudor brutality lingered in the bloodline of every noble family, and none more so than the Spencers. They had survived the executions of queens, the burnings of Protestants, the endless purges of Henry VIII's reign. They had learned how to bow when others broke, how to profit when others bled. But survival was never permanent. The storm of history would always return, testing whether old lessons could still save them. That storm came in the form of the English Civil War. The conflict was not simply about armies clashing on battlefields. It was about the very question of who held power in England, the king, claiming divine right, or Parliament, claiming the authority of the people. For the Spencers, this was not just a philosophical debate. It was a choice that could mean wealth or ruin, life or death. Henry Spencer, the first Earl of Sunderland, chose his side. In 1642, when the drums of war began to beat, he stood with King Charles I. It was a familiar decision. For generations, the Spencers had tied themselves to crowns, not causes. Kings, after all, had rewarded them for loyalty, Parliament had little to offer but uncertainty. And so Henry pledged not only his allegiance, but his fortune. He loaned Charles £10,000, a staggering sum at the time, enough to equip armies, enough to show where his heart and his gamble lay. But this time, the gamble failed. On September 20, 1643, at the Battle of Newbury, Henry Spencer met his end. He was just 23 years old, cut down in the chaos of musket fire and cavalry charges. To his supporters, it was a noble sacrifice for king and country. But history has judged it differently. Henry was not a martyr for principle, he was a casualty of misplaced loyalty, a man who chose to fight for a monarch whose belief in divine right blinded him to reality. The irony is stark. For a family that had always prided itself on calculation and adaptation, Henry Spencer died because he failed to adapt. The same bloodline that had thrived by bending with the political winds now found itself broken against them. His death was less a heroic finale than a warning. Even the most cunning families could not always outmaneuver history. Yet the Spencers did not vanish with Henry. Survival was etched too deeply into their lineage. His son, Robert Spencer, inherited both the title and the burden. And unlike his father, Robert understood that the days of blind loyalty were over. If the Tudors had taught the Spencers how to benefit from cruelty, the Stuarts would teach them how to master betrayal. Robert Spencer, the second Earl of Sunderland, became one of the most notorious politicians of his age. Contemporaries described him as slippery, heartless, and without scruple. He was the kind of man who could shake your hand in the morning and sign your death warrant by nightfall. Where Henry had died clinging to loyalty, Robert thrived by abandoning it. He served as Secretary of State under multiple monarchs, switching allegiances as easily as changing coats. To his critics, he was a traitor in silk robes, a man who valued power above honor. To his family, he was a survivor. The contrast between father and son could not have been sharper. Henry's loyalty brought an early grave. Robert's treachery brought wealth, influence, and longevity. The lesson was clear: survival was not about courage. It was about flexibility. In a world where kings lost their heads, literally, as Charles I did in 1649, the only constant was change. This pattern repeated again and again in the Spencer story. When the monarchy was restored under Charles II, Robert was there, ingratiating himself with the new court. When James II's Catholic policy sparked rebellion, Robert quietly repositioned himself to avoid being dragged down. He learned to betray not in moments of panic, but as a strategy. Betrayal became his currency, his gift, his weapon. It is tempting to despise him, and many did. But perhaps the more unsettling truth is this: Robert embodied the very qualities that had defined the Spencer bloodline from the beginning. Adaptation. Calculation. A willingness to sacrifice principle for survival. He was not a deviation from the family's legacy, he was its perfection. And yet, beneath this success, there was a darker cost. The Spencers had long since abandoned the idea of moral certainty. They had learned too well from the Tudors that conviction was dangerous. Better to bend, to compromise, to betray, than to stand and be crushed. Their rise was undeniable, but so was the stain on their name. The chapel at Great Brington filled with monuments to their dead, statues carved in marble, effigies lying in eternal prayer. But behind the stone serenity lay a truth written in silence: these were not heroes. They were survivors. And survival often meant blood on one's hands. It is here that the story of the Spencers takes on a pattern eerily familiar to later generations. Henry Spencer, the loyalist, echoes in the tragic figure of Diana, both caught by loyalty to a system that devoured them. Robert Spencer, the opportunist, foreshadows the instincts of William and Harry, learning to read the winds of public opinion, shifting their roles to maintain survival in a world that demands both spectacle and compromise. The Civil War may seem distant, its muskets silent and its kings long dead. But the lesson the Spencers carried from it: bend, betray, endure, remained alive. It would shape not just their politics, but their psychology, their very blood. By the time the smoke cleared and the monarchy returned, the Spencers had secured their place once more. They had lost Henry on the battlefield, but they had gained Robert in the court. Their name would continue, their fortune would grow, their influence would spread. But the cost was moral clarity, traded away for another generation of survival. It is a trade the family made again and again. And by the time Diana Spencer was born into this legacy, the habits of compromise and survival had been etched so deeply into the family's DNA that they shaped not just their choices, but their very identities. The Tudors had taught the Spencers to profit from executions. The Civil War had taught them to betray for survival. Together, these lessons formed a bloodline primed to thrive in cruelty and chaos. And as history marched forward, into the Restoration, into the age of Charles II, into the scandals of illegitimate heirs, the Spencers would once again find themselves standing in the shadows of kings, profiting from their vices, their excesses, and their sins. When the monarchy returned to England in 1660, it came not as a solemn restoration of order but as a carnival of indulgence. After years of civil war and Cromwell's Puritan austerity, Charles II stepped onto the throne like a man determined to reclaim every pleasure that had been denied. He was witty, charming, and endlessly charismatic. But behind the laughter of his court lay corruption, scandal, and a legacy of illegitimate children that would entwine forever with the bloodline of the Spencers. Charles II married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess. Their union was meant to strengthen international alliances, but it produced no heirs. Instead, Charles filled his palaces with mistresses, actresses, courtiers' wives, noblewomen, even commoners. His reign was marked by laughter and lust, his court notorious for its moral laxity. And yet, while Catherine remained childless, Charles acknowledged at least a dozen illegitimate children. Far from being hidden in shame, these royal bastards were elevated. They were given dukedoms, wealth, and influence, establishing dynasties that would shape British politics for centuries. Among them were Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton, and Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, both of whom would eventually contribute their blood to the Spencer line. For the Spencers, these connections were invaluable. Through careful marriages and alliances, Diana Spencer's ancestors bound themselves to the descendants of these illegitimate sons. Adelaide Seymour and Rosalind Bingham, Diana's great-grandmothers, carried this blood forward. By the time Diana was born in the 20th century, her family tree traced directly back to Charles II, not through his queen, but through the children of his mistresses. It is a detail both fascinating and unsettling. The People's Princess, known for her grace and compassion, carried in her veins the legacy of a king who put pleasure before duty, who allowed his court to become synonymous with vice. Charles II was not a monster like Henry VIII, but his reign was no less destructive in its own way. His indulgence restored monarchy but weakened its moral authority, setting a precedent that power could be sustained through charm rather than principle. To understand the Spencer inheritance is to understand this paradox. Diana's bloodline carried both the dignity of legitimate nobility and the scandal of illegitimate heirs. She was descended not from the lawful queen who shared Charles's throne, but from the women who shared his bed. The symbolism runs deep. For centuries, illegitimacy was a stain, a brand of shame. Yet in Charles's court, it became a badge of privilege. His sons, though born on the wrong side of the blanket, were raised to be dukes and statesmen. They inherited titles and lands as though their mother's disgrace were irrelevant. The Spencers, by joining themselves to this bloodline, embraced the contradiction, prestige built on scandal, respectability masking indulgence. The court of Charles II was a place where masks were everything. In the candlelit halls of Whitehall, courtiers in lace and velvet danced and schemed, their laughter concealing daggers. It was a theater of excess, where loyalty could be bought with a smile and discarded with a glance. And the Spencers, descendants of survivors, knew how to play their part. They tied themselves to the fortunes of these royal bastards, understanding that in this world, legitimacy mattered less than proximity to power. But beneath the glitter lay darker truths. Charles II's reign came after the execution of his father, Charles I, a king who had insisted on divine right and paid for it with his head. The restoration was meant to heal the nation, but instead it exposed its fractures. The king's personal life became a metaphor for his monarchy, lively, indulgent, but fragile. He secured loyalty not through principle, but through patronage and pleasure. The Spencers' involvement in this era reveals their defining characteristic once again: adaptation. They did not cling to old ideals of purity or honor. Instead, they understood that survival meant weaving themselves into the messy, scandalous web of royal blood, even if that blood was illegitimate. Generations later, when Diana stood before the world, radiant in her wedding gown, millions saw innocence and purity. Few recognized that behind her was a lineage tied to mistresses and scandal, to courts where loyalty was as fleeting as desire. The irony is almost theatrical: the princess celebrated for her compassion was also the heir to a dynasty of calculated indulgence. And yet, this contradiction may help explain her story. Diana lived in a world of media and spectacle, where appearances mattered as much as truth. In this, she mirrored her ancestors, who navigated courts where image was survival. The charm she wielded with the public, the way she could disarm even the harshest critic with a smile, these were the same tools Charles II used to keep his throne secure amid scandal. But just as Charles's court concealed fragility beneath its laughter, so too did Diana's life conceal pain beneath its glamour. The legacy of illegitimacy is not just about scandal. It is about instability, about living always on the edge of rejection, about knowing that one's place depends not on birthright but on performance. The Spencers learned to master this tension. Diana inherited it. The question remains: what does it mean when a family's rise is tied not to lawful succession but to scandalous survival? For the Spencers, it meant opportunity. For Diana, it meant tragedy. Her sons, William and Harry, carry this blood as well. When William ascends the throne, he will not only be the descendant of Charles II through his illegitimate sons but also the first descendant of Charles I to reign since 1714. The irony is staggering. The child of a broken marriage, the grandson of a disgraced princess, will embody the return of a bloodline once thought tarnished beyond repair. The Spencer story in the era of Charles II is not one of honor or loyalty. It is a story of compromise, of opportunism, of survival dressed in velvet and lace. They attached themselves to a monarchy that survived not through righteousness but through charm and indulgence. And in doing so, they carried forward a legacy that would echo down to Diana and beyond. As the candles of Whitehall burned low and courtiers laughed behind jeweled masks, the Spencers once again chose survival over principle. They gained wealth, influence, and prestige. But what they lost, perhaps forever, was the claim to innocence. The story of the Spencers cannot be told without pausing at one of the most infamous figures in English history, King Henry VIII. His name is carved into memory not as a statesman or reformer, but as a monarch who executed wives, dismantled churches, and ruled with a cruelty so absolute that even friends and allies trembled in his presence. And through Mary Bullen, mistress to Henry and sister of his ill-fated Queen Anne, the Spencers became bound to his legacy by blood itself. Mary Bullen is often remembered as the other Bullen girl, overshadowed by her ambitious sister Anne. Yet Mary's story carried profound consequences for the Spencer line. Before Henry's eyes fell on Anne, they lingered on Mary. She became his mistress, and though the king never officially acknowledged any children from the affair, whispers haunted the court. Her daughter, Catherine Carey, was long rumored to be Henry's child. If true, then the blood of the Tudor tyrant ran directly into the veins of the Spencers, carried across centuries until it surfaced again in the life of Princess Diana. This possibility transforms Diana's heritage from symbolic association into biological inheritance. The compassion that endeared her to millions existed side by side with the DNA of a man responsible for nearly 57,000 executions. A king who dissolved monasteries with fire and steel, who silenced dissent with rope and blade, who redefined marriage by destroying those who failed him. The executions of Henry's wives form one of the darkest chapters of English history. Two of them, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, were beheaded, their youth and innocence sacrificed to Henry's paranoia and insatiable hunger for a male heir. The Spencers, connected to both women through Mary, could not escape the shadow of these deaths. They were not merely spectators in history, they were tied to the victims, and perhaps even to the executioner. Anne's fate, already etched into memory, was a masterclass in manufactured justice. Her charges of adultery, incest, and treason were constructed to remove her from Henry's path. Evidence was twisted, testimonies coerced, and the verdict sealed before the trial began. Yet even in death, Anne displayed a dignity that history would not forget. Her final prayer for the king, spoken with composure moments before the sword fell, was less about forgiveness than survival, ensuring her daughter Elizabeth might yet live. The Spencers, through Mary, carried that legacy forward, survival through silence, adaptation through suffering. But Henry's cruelty did not end with Anne. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, barely out of girlhood, was accused of betrayal and condemned under a law he created solely for her destruction. Her last words, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," were a dagger into Henry's pride, but they also revealed the human cost of a monarchy built on fear. For the Spencers, connected by blood to Catherine, the memory of her trembling walk to the scaffold became part of their inheritance. The wider terror of Henry's reign spread beyond the walls of the palace. His dissolution of the monasteries ripped apart centuries of spiritual life. Sacred abbeys were looted, their treasures carted away, their monks left to wander or die. For many, it was an act of desecration. For the Spencers, it was opportunity. Lands stripped from the church were redistributed, and families close to the king, families like the Spencers, benefited. In this, their legacy deepened, wealth built not merely on wool, but on ruins, on stones torn from holy ground, on faith silenced in flames. It is difficult, centuries later, to comprehend the scale of the bloodshed. Historians estimate that Henry VIII's reign claimed nearly 57,000 lives. Some were executed for treason, others for heresy, still others for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Entire monasteries vanished, their inhabitants scattered. The streets of London rang with the cries of the condemned, their heads displayed on spikes above city gates. And yet, through it all, the Spencers prospered. They learned not to oppose the king, but to flow with the tide of his violence. When heads rolled, their coffers filled. When monasteries fell, their estates expanded. They were not executioners, but they were beneficiaries, and in history, that distinction matters little to the victims. The connection through Mary Boleyn also highlights the Spencer paradox, bound by blood both to the victims and the perpetrators. On one side, they shared lineage with queens unjustly executed, women crushed beneath the weight of Henry's will. On the other, they carried the possible DNA of the tyrant himself, the man who ordered the deaths. To be a Spencer was to embody contradiction, innocence and guilt, victim and accomplice, compassion and cruelty. Centuries later, this contradiction re-emerged in Diana. She was celebrated as a woman of kindness, a princess who reached beyond palace walls to touch the lives of AIDS patients, landmine victims, and the homeless. Yet she also lived within a system that devoured her, just as it had devoured Anne, Catherine, and Mary centuries before. Her sense of entrapment, her desperate search for authenticity in a world of spectacle, echoed the struggles of her Boleyn ancestors. The story of Mary Boleyn and Henry VIII is not just a tale of scandal. It is the origin of a bloodline that blended survival with suffering, privilege with peril. The Spencers did not merely watch history unfold, they absorbed it into their very veins. Every execution witnessed, every confiscated estate accepted, every silence chosen over defiance became part of the genetic and cultural inheritance that Diana carried into the 20th century. This is why her death in a Paris tunnel feels less like an isolated tragedy and more like the echo of an ancient curse. From Tower Green to Fotheringhay Castle, from Anne Boleyn's scaffold to Catherine Howard's trembling prayer, the pattern was already there. Women tied to the Spencer line had always suffered at the hands of power. Diana was simply the latest chapter in a book written in blood long before she was born. The Spencers rose from sheep farmers to nobility not by accident, but by adaptation. They aligned themselves with kings who killed, queens who burned, and courts that thrived on betrayal. Mary Boleyn's shadow, her affair with Henry VIII, her possible royal child, was not an anecdote, but a turning point. It injected the Tudor legacy directly into the Spencer bloodstream, binding them forever to the violence, scandal, and survival strategies of England's most infamous dynasty. And as history would prove again and again, once the Spencers tied themselves to power, they could never untangle from its cost. By the mid-16th century, the Spencers were no longer simply wealthy landowners. They were participants, woven into the machinery of monarchy that sustained itself through fear and fire. If Henry VIII had built his reign on executions, his daughter Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, ensured the flames of persecution burned even brighter. Mary Tudor came to the throne in 1553 determined to undo her father's legacy of Protestant reform. To her, England's soul had been stolen by heretics, and it was her sacred duty to restore it. What followed was not merely politics, but a campaign of terror. Hundreds of Protestants were tied to stakes, bundles of wood stacked around their feet. As fire licked upward, crowds watched men, women, and even children scream until their voices cracked. Some burned for 40 minutes, their flesh peeling from bone, their prayers drowned by the roar of flames. For many noble families, this was horror. For the Spencers, it was advantage. Each execution left behind confiscated lands, estates stripped from those branded heretics. Families who once opposed the crown lost everything. And the crown, ever generous to loyal servants, rewarded survivors like the Spencers. Once again, their wealth deepened, their estates expanded. But wealth gained from fire carries its own shadows. The Spencer bloodline became entwined with the victims' ashes, the smoke of martyrdom clinging invisibly to their legacy. Every acre of land was a reminder that their prosperity came not from virtue but from silence, from benefiting while others burned alive. Yet even the flames of Mary Tudor could not compare to the chilling spectacle that followed in 1587, the execution of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart's story was a tragedy written over 19 long years of imprisonment. Once Queen of France, then Queen of Scotland, she became Elizabeth I's captive, locked away in castles and manors across England. To Elizabeth, her Catholic cousin was not just family but a threat, an anointed queen whose very existence invited rebellion. On February 8, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary Stuart's ordeal came to its end. The morning was cold and heavy with mist. Witnesses described her arrival in a gown of black velvet, her face serene. Beneath the black, she wore a crimson petticoat, the Catholic color of martyrdom, chosen deliberately to send one last message. Even in death, she would be theater. She mounted the scaffold with composure, her small frame dwarfed by the block and the axe waiting beside it. Turning to her attendants, she prayed aloud, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The first strike missed her neck, biting into the back of her skull. A gasp ran through the hall. The second blow struck deeper, nearly severing, but she still breathed, lips moving in silent prayer. Only the third strike ended her suffering. But the horror was not done. When the executioner lifted what he believed to be her head, her auburn wig came loose, leaving gray hair in his hand. The head itself thudded to the scaffold floor. Then, from beneath her skirts, a small dog emerged, her beloved pet, its white fur stained with her blood, refusing to leave her body. Even for an age hardened to violence, the sight was too much. Hardened courtiers turned pale, some weeping openly. For the Spencers, tied to Mary's bloodline through generations of alliances, the moment seared itself into their inheritance. They had witnessed many executions, but this one was different. This was regicide dressed as justice, a queen destroyed not for crime but for existing. The execution of Mary Stuart represented the culmination of everything the Tudors embodied: power sustained through brutality, legitimacy upheld by murder, survival purchased at the cost of humanity. And once again, the Spencers were not victims but beneficiaries. With Mary gone, Elizabeth's Protestant regime grew secure. Noble families tied to Elizabeth, including the Spencers, continued to thrive. It is tempting to view these events as distant, relics of a crueler age. Yet centuries later, when Diana Spencer died violently in Paris, echoes of Fotheringhay Castle resurfaced. Both women were charismatic, both symbols of alternative authority, both destroyed by forces larger than themselves. Mary Stuart's crimson petticoat and Diana's white Mercedes belonged to different centuries, but the message was the same: those tied too closely to power could never escape its cost. The Spencer inheritance is not simply land and wealth. It is memory, of fire-consuming Protestants, of swords-ending queens, of an axe clumsy in its work. It is the knowledge that survival often meant profiting from others' destruction. And it is the burden of watching, of remembering, of carrying forward the ghosts of those who died while they lived. By the late 16th century, the Spencers had secured their place as one of England's most formidable families. They had risen from sheep farmers to nobles through opportunity, marriage, and an unflinching willingness to adapt. Yet each step upward left blood beneath their feet. The world of Mary Tudor and Mary Stuart was not simply a chapter in history, it was a crucible. It forged in the Spencer bloodline traits that would persist for centuries: resilience, opportunism, silence in the face of horror. These were the same qualities Diana would inherit, though she chose to wield them differently, not for survival within a murderous court, but for compassion in a world of cameras and crowds. Still, history does not easily release its grip. The flames of Bloody Mary and the axe of Fotheringhay whispered across centuries into Diana's fate. She, too, was a queen of hearts caught in a system that demanded sacrifice. And her death, like theirs, became a performance for the world, violent, sudden, unforgettable. For the Spencers, every execution, every confiscation, every silence carried forward into their legacy. By the time Elizabeth I passed and the Tudor dynasty ended, the family had already bound itself to centuries of tragedy. And though dynasties would change, wars would come and go, and empires would rise and fall, the lessons of fire and axe remained etched in Spencer blood. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Spencers had already survived the worst storms of Tudor England. They had watched queens die, monks burn, and rivals vanish. They had prospered in silence, adapting to the brutality of monarchs who ruled as gods on earth. Yet the next century would test their survival in new ways, not through religious terror, but through civil war, political betrayal, and the temptations of empire. The death of Henry Spencer at the Battle of Newbury in 1643 had already shown the dangers of loyalty. The young Earl had pledged himself to Charles I, a king who believed too deeply in divine right and too little in compromise. His death was not heroic, it was inevitable. For once, a Spencer had chosen principle, and principle led to the grave. But Henry's son, Robert Spencer, understood the lesson differently. Where his father had been loyal, he would be flexible. Where his father had given gold to a doomed king, he would trade his allegiance for influence. To his contemporaries, Robert was slippery, heartless, a man without scruple. To history, he was the perfect Spencer. As the second Earl of Sunderland, Robert became one of the most notorious political operators of his age. He served under two monarchs, shifting positions as tides demanded. Allies called him indispensable, enemies called him a traitor. He betrayed causes as easily as others changed clothes, sacrificing principle for survival with a calm smile. It was not courage that kept him alive, but calculation. And this was precisely the inheritance that defined his bloodline. From the Tudors they had learned that justice was a performance, from Robert they learned that betrayal was a tool. The Spencers were no longer just survivors of monarchs, they were active manipulators of the politics that sustained them. This talent carried forward as England transformed into Britain, as empire expanded, and as wealth flowed across oceans. The Spencers, once sheep farmers, now sat at the table of empire builders. They had estates, titles, and marriages that tied them to nearly every major family in Europe. Yet their core strategy never changed: bend, adapt, betray if necessary. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the family had become entrenched in aristocracy. Their great estate at Althorpe stood as a symbol of wealth and continuity. Yet beneath its serene gardens and marble halls lay centuries of compromise. Each brick, each gilded portrait, was bought with silence during someone else's suffering. It is in this period that the Spencer legacy began to reach across the Atlantic. Frances Work, Diana's great-great-grandmother, married into the family, bringing with her the energy of American wealth. Her eventual divorce in 1891 scandalized newspapers on both sides of the ocean. But the very fact that her story was front-page news demonstrates the Spencers' enduring relevance. They were not merely aristocrats, they were symbols of the uneasy marriage between Old World titles and New World fortunes. The Spencer bloodline, however, was not done shaping world history. Its influence resurfaced in the figure of Winston Churchill, whose mother was born a Spencer. To many, Churchill is remembered as the indomitable leader of Britain during World War II, the man who stood firm when Europe trembled. Yet his career, when seen through the Spencer lens, reveals something more complex. Churchill embodied the family's gift for survival through ruthless calculation. At Gallipoli in 1915, his strategic misjudgment cost thousands of lives. During the Bengal famine of 1943, his policies and dismissals contributed to the deaths of millions. And in 1945, he ordered the bombing of Dresden, creating a firestorm that incinerated between 25,000 and 35,000 civilians. These were not accidents. They were the cold arithmetic of power, decisions made not for mercy but for advantage. In this, Churchill resembled his Spencer ancestors more than perhaps he realized. He displayed the same willingness to trade lives for strategy, the same belief that survival of the state outweighed survival of the individual. His victories saved Britain, but his methods echoed the cruelty of Tudors long dead. The connection to Churchill illustrates how deeply the Spencer legacy seeped into modern times. The same instincts that once allowed them to navigate Tudor courts, the ability to manipulate, to calculate, to endure by sacrificing others, had not vanished. They had simply evolved. In Churchill, the ruthless pragmatism of the Spencers became national policy. This raises a question that lingers over the family like a shadow: is their survival instinct a gift or a curse? For centuries, it allowed them to prosper when others perished. But it also left behind a trail of suffering, from Tudor executions to firestorms over German cities. And yet, just as the Spencers have always embodied contradiction, so too did Churchill. Alongside his ruthlessness was brilliance, alongside his failures, triumphs. He gave Britain the words and will to resist Hitler, just as he gave Bengal famine victims nothing but indifference. He embodied the paradox that has defined the family from the beginning: saviors to some, executioners to others. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Spencers had mastered the art of reinvention. They were no longer opportunists on the margins of power, they were power itself. Their estates attracted pilgrims of history, their marriages tied them to royalty, their descendants shaped politics across continents. But the price of survival remained the same. Their story was still written in compromise, still shadowed by the ghosts of queens, martyrs, and innocents consumed in flames. When Diana Spencer was born into this family centuries later, she inherited not only the elegance of her lineage but also its burden. Her humanitarian work, her willingness to reach out to the sick, the marginalized, the unloved, can be seen as an unconscious attempt to balance the scales. To atone for Churchill's firestorms, Henry VIII's scaffolds, Mary Tudor's flames. She may never have framed it in those terms, but her instincts were the opposite of her ancestors: where they chose silence, she chose voice; where they chose survival at any cost, she chose compassion. And yet, even she could not escape the Spencer pattern entirely. Her death, sudden, violent, and surrounded by conspiracy theories, echoed the suspicious deaths and betrayals that had marked the family for centuries. Just as Robert Spencer thrived by betrayal, Diana was undone by it, betrayed by a marriage, hounded by media, abandoned by the very institution she tried to serve. The Spencers' legacy, then, is not a straight line of progress or decline. It is a cycle: survival, betrayal, power, tragedy. From Henry Spencer's fall at Newbury to Churchill's ruthless wartime decisions, from Robert Spencer's treachery to Diana's compassion, the same blood has carried both cruelty and redemption. And as history moved into the 20th century, that cycle remained unbroken, waiting for the next generation to decide whether to repeat it, or to end it once and for all. By the time Diana Spencer was born in 1961, the family name already carried centuries of shadows. Behind the aristocratic facade of Althorpe lay stories of queens who lost their heads, martyrs who burned, wars fought and lost, betrayals committed and justified. Diana, however, was not raised to inherit power in the way her ancestors once had. She grew up shy, awkward, a girl whose smile hid loneliness. No one could have guessed she would become the most famous woman in the world, or that her fate would mirror so much of the Spencer legacy. When she married Prince Charles in 1981, it seemed like a fairy tale. A shy young woman transformed into a princess before millions of eyes, stepping into St. Paul's Cathedral in her gown of ivory silk and endless train. The world saw romance. In truth, Diana was entering another Tudor court, a world of spectacle and calculation, where appearances mattered more than truth and where survival required both charm and resilience. And Diana had charm in abundance. She connected with people in a way few royals ever had. She touched AIDS patients without gloves when fear and stigma kept others away. She walked among landmine victims in Angola, knelt beside the homeless, embraced the sick. She gave to the powerless what her ancestors had denied them: dignity. To a public weary of distant monarchy, she became the people's princess. Yet even as the world adored her, the machinery of monarchy turned cold. Just as Anne Boleyn had discovered, affection at court was conditional. Charles's affair with Camilla haunted the marriage. Diana famously said there were 3 of us in this marriage, and in those words echoed centuries of Spencer women who had been betrayed, discarded, or sacrificed for dynastic convenience. The pressures grew unbearable. The media, once her ally, became her predator. Paparazzi stalked her every move, reducing her humanity to photographs sold for profit. The very charm she wielded to survive turned against her, just as Spencer Cunning had so often done before. She was adored, but she was also hunted. On August 31, 1997, in a Paris tunnel, the cycle of Spencer tragedy reached its climax. Fleeing photographers, Diana's car crashed. She died hours later. The parallels to her ancestors were chilling. Like Mary, Queen of Scots, she died far from freedom, surrounded by witnesses but powerless to escape. Like Catherine Howard, she was young, vibrant, and betrayed by those meant to protect her. Like Anne Boleyn, her death became a performance, played out not on a scaffold, but on television screens across the world. And like so many before her, her end was sudden, violent, and shrouded in suspicion. Diana's funeral was a spectacle of grief unmatched in modern times. Millions lined the streets, millions more watched on television. Yet beneath the mourning lay an irony as sharp as any Tudor sword. The woman celebrated for compassion was the descendant of a bloodline built on cruelty. She had tried, perhaps unconsciously, to redeem that legacy. But redemption came at a cost. Her sons, William and Harry, became the new bearers of the Spencer inheritance. They carry in their veins the blood of Henry VIII, of Charles II, of Mary Boleyn, of Churchill. But they also carry Diana's compassion, her refusal to accept the cold distance of monarchy. In them lies the question, will the cycle continue, or will it finally break? William has chosen caution. His path echoes the calculating pragmatism of Robert Spencer, careful to adapt, cautious never to step too far from tradition. As heir to the throne, he must balance survival with responsibility. His advocacy for mental health awareness, his quiet dignity in public, his steady hand in times of crisis, these are the modern expressions of Spencer adaptability. But this time, the calculation serves not betrayal, but healing. Harry, by contrast, embodies rebellion. His decision to step away from royal duties, to speak openly about institutional failures, to move to America, this is unprecedented in modern monarchy. Yet it also mirrors the Spencer instinct to reposition geographically and politically when survival demands it. Like his ancestors, he knows when to walk away. Unlike them, he frames it not as betrayal, but as authenticity. Together, William and Harry represent 2 sides of the Spencer coin, calculation and rebellion. Both carry the potential to break free from the family's dark inheritance. Both also risk repeating its patterns of compromise and scandal. The future will judge which path they choose. And what of Diana's grandchildren, George, Charlotte, and Louis? They represent a new generation, unburdened by the immediate tragedies of Tudor scaffolds or Paris tunnels. Yet their DNA still carries centuries of survival strategies and scars. Scientists tell us trauma leaves imprints, not only in culture but in genes. The fear, betrayal, and violence endured by their ancestors may still whisper in their cells. But so, too, may Diana's compassion. The Spencer family motto reads, "God defend the right." For centuries, it was little more than a justification for brutality, a way to claim that executions, betrayals, and compromises were somehow divinely ordained. Today, perhaps for the first time, its meaning can change. If William and Harry, and their children after them, choose empathy over ambition, service over survival, then the motto may finally become true. The black diagonal band on the Spencer coat of arms has long symbolized the family's dark history. But heraldry is not destiny. That same band could stand as a reminder of the shadows overcome, of a family that chose not to repeat its past but to transform it. The 3 silver shells on that band, once symbols of pilgrimage, may now represent a journey from cruelty to compassion. The question, as always, remains unanswered. History is heavy, and the Spencer bloodline has carried it for 6 centuries. But every generation has a choice. Diana made hers. She chose kindness in a world of calculation, honesty in a court of masks, compassion where cruelty had once reigned. She did not erase her ancestors' sins, but she showed another path. Her sons now walk that path in different ways. One cautious, one rebellious, both shaped by her legacy. Whether they will finally redeem the Spencer name or continue its cycle of tragedy is yet to be seen. But the fact that the question can even be asked is itself a kind of progress. And so the story of the Spencers ends where it began, with survival. From sheep farmers in Warwickshire to queens on the scaffold, from firelit stakes to modern paparazzi, from betrayal to compassion, the bloodline has endured. But survival is no longer enough. For the Spencers of today, survival must give way to redemption. Only then can the people's princess rest, not as the latest victim of a family curse, but as the first to break it.